Well, it's coming up, and we'll see. I'll kind of just get started without my slides. They're not that exciting. Okay, Capistrano is a deployment framework. What is a deployment framework? Basically, it's a set of scripts that allow you to do things from one box to a remote box, usually some kind of server, without having to log into that box directly. Big things that Capistrano gives you as far as benefits is it's automated, so you're going to get consistency. You can push to, it scales up to a large number of boxes. You can define different roles for various machines. And also it gives you speed because you are going and farming those commands out, once from your command line, and off they go. There are some real basic assumptions that Capistrano makes that if you aren't willing to comply with, you're out of luck, basically. Capistrano assumes SSH communication with all of your machines. So if you can't log into a box over an SSH client, Capistrano is not going to do you any good. It also assumes a POSIX shell once you do log in. So if you're logging into SSH.com's SSH server on a Windows server, that's not going to get you there. However, Cygwin runs just fine and dandy on any Windows box, and that does give you a POSIX shell in that Windows environment. So if you're willing to comply with those two things, the last little thing that's a turn off for some people is Capistrano assumes that you like the command line. If you want a big, pretty, fancy GUI, I'm sure that you can put a call into the guys at 5runs over in Texas, and they will be right with you. But if you're happy on the command line and you've got a terminal up anyway, then Capistrano may be the right choice for you. Yay! This church is somewhere in Virginia that I've never been to. But there's a guy who takes really awesome pictures. It's actually 5 exposed pictures, photoshopped on top of each other. So, that's one of the things I think that's really cool about them, is they're also high resolution images. Okay. Come on. Now we have to do a successfully launched NeoOffice, and we'll be in good shape. No, this is a brand new. I don't know. Like I said, it's had some oddities so far, so it's going to go in for some pretty serious burn-in testing here in the not-too-distant future. I'll build up a case history and make good on it. No, leave the wife at home. She has too much fun in the Mac store. Oh, yeah. No, there is no doubt. My wife works for Nokia. She's a usability engineer. She would probably kill for an iPhone. Let's see if this is going to... That's not really a shocker. 80% of all... That's not what I want. Can't blame them. Alright, where is... There we go. Ta-da! And finally, we're up and running. Okay. The beginning. Okay, I'm Rob Kaufman. This is some information about me. I work for Mingle. My blog is at lightningtree.net. You can hit me up at rgkaufman. My middle name is Glenn. That's why it's a G. At gmail.com or just on the mailing list. They kind of go to the same place. Okay, what is Capistrano? Capistrano is a stop on the local rail line. You get on the Amtrak and you go north. It's known for its missions. Used to have a really great coffee house that they turned into a Starbucks.
Serious? That old? It was like a 50s?
Yeah, the Dietrich's is gone. It is also, and by the way, up until 6 months ago, if you search for rails and Capistrano, you got a lot of stuff about the Amtrak station. That has completely changed. A deployment solution. It's a general purpose remote execution tool. You will still see references to it as Switch Tower. Somebody decided that name was theirs legitimately, and that they kind of had a beef about it being taken over by the Ruby community. So we moved away from that. There's a lot happening in Capistrano right now because there's a move to 2.0. 2.0 is a complete rewrite. So, I guess I feel like it's really important to get information about 2.0 out now. I originally came to Ruby right in the middle of the transition from 1.6 to 1.8 when all of the documentation was for 1.6 and all of the code was for 1.8. Nothing confuses new users more than that transition period. So I think it's really important that we all talk about it as much as possible. I'm going to focus on 2.0. There's a lot out there on the existing stuff. Here's my list of reasons that I talked about a minute ago. I have been known to start deploying the website and then go to the bathroom or go home for the day, knowing that if it doesn't go right, everything's going to be fine. And I'm not going to have my phone go off and tell me, hey, the server's down. What the heck did you do? That's a big safety net. There are friends of mine who work in Java labs and .NET labs that think I'm totally nuts when I tell them that. This is a slide about the assumptions. Installing. That's kind of step one. Assuming you have Ruby installed and Ruby gems installed. Basically, the beta gem is not in the current Ruby gems, though there was a small period of time that it was in the main Ruby gems because somebody was using Ho for their deployment. It was nice and automated, so it got posted to everyone for a little period of time. That's been straightened out now. You can get it from gems.rubyonrails.com. Because you're going to grab it right now from gems.rubyonrails.com, you have to satisfy the prerequisites first from the main gems repository. Gems isn't smart enough to, if you tell it an address, to think, oh, well, that's not here, maybe I'll go look at my home. It just looks exactly where you tell it, and that's it. Things that you need are net SSH, net SFTP, and Highline. SSH and SFTP are pretty obvious what they do. Highline just gives you some general, like, command line magic. It lets you put little asterisks on the terminal instead of your password. Has a really nice, clean, textual, interactive interface. And then installing the beta gem once you've met those prerequisites is gem install -s means the server, and the word Capistrano. So let's talk about Rails and Capistrano first. If you have a Rails application and you want to move it from a previous version of Capistrano to the current, or just it's never had Capistrano before, you're going to capify your app, which is just running the command capify and dot or the directory name in the root of your Rails application. That's going to create a file called cap file. It'll sit right there next to rake file. And it'll give you some magic right off the bat. There's stuff that it can do right out of the box without any more messing around. At any time, you can see what tasks your Capistrano installation is capable of by going cap and then -T. The capital T is the same as it is in rake, and it'll just give you a list of the tasks that are available and their textual descriptions. -E will give you, and the name of a task will give you a longer description. Like if it has a full RDoc page, it'll show you that information. One of the things that's changed from previous versions to 2.0 is that documentation actually exists for the majority of the default tasks now. Hopefully that trend is going to keep going, and as people add stuff to Capistrano, we'll all have the luxury of having some idea how it works instead of just digging in and figuring it out ourselves. That cap file is your recipe. It's how your application, how Capistrano knows where it's supposed to go and what it's supposed to do. To set variables in Capistrano, you use the set command, followed by a symbol, followed by the value. This is relatively familiar for those of you who've used Rake. Lots of other Ruby DSLs look a lot like this. That's because this is easy to do. So what you do is you have to tell it, okay, what is your application called? Simple enough question. Where is the Subversion repository? The default Capistrano recipe assumes you're in Subversion. You don't have to be in Subversion, but you do need to have your code somewhere that is accessible from the remote server. There are several SCM options, which is what you see under set SCM. Subversion is just the default and is by far the easiest to use because it's the most thoroughly debugged and most widely spread amongst the Rails community. Not so much the rest of the world, but we're getting there. You have to, if you want to tell it what directory to deploy to specifically on those remote servers, then you set the deploy to variable. The default has changed from previous versions. It is now /u/apps and then the name of the application. I'm hoping that /u will be a short-lived kind of deal because I think that the POSIX file system needs another convention, like it needs rm-r/. It just seems really wasteful to come up with something brand new again, but that's where we're at today. I don't know. I would imagine that on Jameis's box /u is probably a symlink to somewhere else. But that's just a guess, And then you say, okay, I have these are the standard roles. These are kind of the most common in a Rails stack. For your first Rails application, these are all the same box, and that's totally okay. But you tell it the address of, or the URL for your app server, which is where you're going to run the Rails app itself, your web server, which is where you're going to run whatever's in front of that app, and where your database is living. Now that you've filled out that tiny little form that is a configuration file, but we have to tell the app some things, you can tell it cap deploy setup. This, for the first time, is going to ask you your password for the remote boxes. It will make your life substantially easier if it is either the same for all your boxes, which is a bad idea, or if you have SSH passkeys set up so that you can log in to all those boxes. I'm going to be really honest with you. I tend to use passkeys with empty passwords. But the passwords, the safest thing you can do, the right thing you can do, is have SSH passkeys set up on your boxes with a password for those passwords for those passkeys. There are lots and lots of resources online on how to set that whole system up. Anyway, you can run cap setup, and what that's going to do is it's going to create, in this instance, /u/app/ the name of our Rails application, and kind of populate it with some basic files that it needs to know about. To make sure all of your servers have all of the prerequisites to run Capistrano on them, like actually have Subversion installed on them so you can check out, that you can log into all of them, all those little things that will make your life so much easier when you're trying to figure out why, 40 boxes work, but box 41 doesn't. We have cap deploy check. -Q means quiet. And so it doesn't show you all the checks it does. It just shows you a nice little report of, hey, you don't have Subversion installed on this box, and you said there was a database here, but I don't see no stinking database. What's going on? Your first deploy, obviously there's nothing running yet. Your application isn't happily churning away because you haven't ever deployed it. You deploy cold. Deploy cold allows you at any time to deploy your app to the servers without starting it. Okay? Or more specifically, without restarting it. Once that's done and been successful, in the future, you'll just do cap deploy, which is going to check your app out of Subversion into a directory while your web server's still flying along serving pages. And then it's going to take your Mongrel or fastCGI processes and shut all the old ones down and start the new ones up, giving you a nice clean transition point that's kind of as short as it can be reasonably between when your app is live on the old code and live on the new code. Capistrano gives you transactions. What that means is if halfway through your checkout process you run out of disk space, instead of just trying to start up the new server on the broken checkout, it just rolls everything back and deletes all the files for you. If someone's checked a really large image into a system that only has 4 gigs of space, it gets deleted during the rollback, and so it looks like there's plenty of space and can make you really crazy at about 3 in the morning. Not that I would know. Okay, so let's talk about, you've got your basic recipe and that's all great and you're deploying and everything. Now you want to do something custom. You want to do something that's just yours. You want to step away from the bell, book, and candle of, I followed this tutorial on this blog and it got me here. Or I, went through these slides and this is where I got to. So let's break down a little bit about what a task looks like. Tasks in Capistrano are very much the same as tasks in Rake. It's a DSL that gives you a definition of a lot like a function or method, but with some kind of syntactic sugar to make it clear as to what you're trying to do. Okay, let's start at the very top here. The role is basically lets you set up, like before we talked about the database role, the app role. If you're saying, okay, boxes that prescribe to a certain role are meeting a certain need, they have a certain function. This particular example shows setting up a box to run background processes via cron. So what we're going to do is we're going to keep a cron tab in our application under config, and then when we deploy, we're going to say every time we deploy, we want to check out the latest cron tab with our app. We want that to run, so that it's all of our background tasks are specified with our app. It's going to run as the same user as the rest of the app. This is production code. We use this. I probably use this in every single app I have background tasks in now. So we have a description. That's just a spot for you to say to the world what the heck this code is. This desk line is what shows up when you do rake-t or cap-t. You get this text back. Add the cron tab, but only to one server. Namespaces are relatively familiar to most programmers. It's a way of breaking code up into addressable segments. Anyone who's seen either a .NET or Java structure, the system, .in, that's all namespacing. The task description itself, what we're saying here is after default, which means that the deploy namespace has a default task called deploy. And that's what runs if you don't say deploy : cold deploy or deploy : cleanup or anything else. It's just the default. So what we're saying is after the default runs, and after underscore has special meaning, before underscore also has special meaning in Capistrano. But every time the default task runs, when it's done, if for every server that's the background server and is the primary background server, so only one of them, we're going to go through and say, as root, install the cron tab for the current user from where we just checked out our code to. Okay? The part in quotes there is a Unix command, as you'd run it from the command line with regular Ruby string substitution. And then we close up everything and we're done. And so what this would do is every time you deploy the website, it would take that cron tab and install it as the current cron tab. Cron comes along and it does its work, just like it's been doing for, I'm not even going to try and guess how many years, but a really long time, and it's really good at it now, because all it does is that one little thing of taking tasks that you want to run in from time to time and running them on time. So maybe you're not a Rails guy. Maybe you want to deploy something else using this. Maybe you have a bunch of server maintenance tasks that you run every Friday and, you'd rather go to the beach instead. Capistrano can still really help you out. It is not tied to Rails in any way. It's developed by the core team. There's definitely some mixing of kind of nomenclature there, but that doesn't mean it's not useful to PHP programmers and Java guys and anybody else who has a bunch of stuff they have to do on some box that isn't the box they're normally logged in on. This particular set of tasks, all it does is shows you the run command. Run is just go to the box and do this string as if I typed it in. Sudo could be used here also, which is, go to the box and do it as root. We see that roles aren't necessarily contained to, server roles. This is just a role of everyone that would have libraries on it that we care about searching for XML or, counting. Okay? New with 2.0 is a Capistrano shell and Capistrano invoke. Cap invoke just says, hey, look at my recipe file. I listed all my servers in there, and I want to see if any of them have free disk space right now. df-h means show me what the free versus used disk space is on a Unix box. Cap invoke lets you just specify the command right there. You can you can kind of narrow it down to whatever roles that you have specified. Also, if you're only care about seeing one host, you can say, hey, only look at the one host. If you issued these three commands in order, it would initiate three separate communication instances. So it's logging in via SSH, creating a new shell, doing the task, returning the result, closing the SSH terminal or connection each time. If you had 20 things to run, that's awful costly, time-wise. So what you can do instead is cap shell. Cap shell is going to give you a little command line looking thing that's very much as if you had started an SSH session on each of your boxes that's specified in your cap file and were logged in so that everything you typed in the shell is being mirrored on all of those boxes. So you can get yourself into a world of trouble that way if you so choose. But you can also do some basic tasks really fast. If you have to repeat it on each box separately, you're not going to type the same thing every time. You're going to get distracted, or you're going to miss a command or whatever. This means it's all going to all those boxes at the same time once. Yep.
What does the output look like? Is it like server 1 with this output, server 2 with this stuff?
Let's see if I have an example of that. There we go. That's alright, I'm almost out of slides anyway. I love Office software. Ooh, all kinds of stuff left open. Here we go. Okay. Let's bring that up a little bit. So, now this is with verbose mode, so it's a little more talkative, but it gives you kind of the basics. It's going to show you the name of that box. This is one of those times when abbreviating the name is probably worthwhile. If your roles are really long, everything's going to just get pushed off to the side, and then show you the results. So he's basically logged into a shell, and he says, hey, run the uptime command on each box, and this is what the output would look like.
That's an IRB shell.
Yes. It is, the magic behind there is IRB is launching, and then Capistrano object is being included, and that's how you get there. Yeah. It's actually really short code. Okay. So those are the basics of Capistrano. That's going to let you go out there and automate some Ruby tasks or some server tasks that you want to automate for whatever. Get you up and deployed on a Rails instance. The basics. So what's beyond the basics? Well, the first thing beyond the basics is taking Capistrano recipes from the older version and converting them to the new version. There are definitely some gotchas in the transition to 2.0. A good list of them is this new Beyond Rails article. The vast majority of the ones I ran into were already listed there with a nice little, and this is the solution right beneath it. Also, there is an upgrade section on the capify.org website, which is the homepage of Capistrano. That's also new for 2.0. Capistrano's never had a homepage before. So that's kind of exciting. The hope that there might be some, community there that kind of maintains that a little bit more separated from Rails. And if people are using Capistrano and are interested in those challenges, I'd be happy to talk on it. I've had to go through quite a bit of recipes and convert them over already. So I feel like I was doing a lot of the stuff that you can do with Capistrano, and when I put this box together, I managed to do it right in the gap during when Ruby Gems was downloading the beta. So I just started upgrading and kind of haven't looked back. But if, nobody's really up and running and facing those problems, I don't want to waste your guys' time on it. Because in 6 months, it's going to be completely moot knowledge anyway, right? We at Mingle have Capistrano recipes that take a brand new stock Gen 2 box, and then I usually, from our image that I work from or custom, I compile Ruby, and I get Subversion going, and I install Apache. And then all of the Apache configuration, all of the Mongo configuration, all of the database configuration is loaded and kept with each application in a set of recipe files that are the same for all our applications. So there's variable substitution in there that says, okay, well, this is Climber, this is Edlone, it goes in this directory, its Mongo processes look like this, its, vhost file looks like that, and it's all automated to bring a new box up. So you can get really involved with this. There are recipes out there for Ubuntu and Gentoo and several other Linux distributions. I think somewhere around there are ones for Solaris that the Joint guys put together, or that somebody put together for the Joint accelerators. And a lot of the shared hosts now have different, basically deployment recipes that you can just grab to get your initial setup done right off the bat without having to spend all that time manually configuring Apache and, all of that fun and exciting time. Also, another relatively quick thing that happens if you're checking out your code, especially if you're deploying 4 and 5 times a day because you're in really active development, is you realize you're using a substantial chunk of your hard drive to just store copies of your Subversion repository. Capistrano doesn't clean up after itself by default. And it's really nice that it leaves the last copy or the last couple copies there in case, you deploy and all hell breaks loose and everyone starts screaming and yelling and running around, that you can sit there and type cap, space, rollback, enter, and then all of the damage and chaos is gone. Right? It's real fast. It just has to drop the current mongrels, start the old ones back up, change some symlinks and all, and you're good to go. However, when you have 75 copies of an application checked out on your hard drive, it's kind of wasteful. When that's mirrored over 4 or 5 servers, it gets really wasteful. So, we kind of settled on 5 copies to be checked out. And you can kind of automate Capistrano so that it just, in that, that after default block I showed you before, if you put cleanup in that block, it'll run the cleanup script, and cap cleanup, what it does is it goes and says, oh, you only wanted 5 copies, okay, I'll go delete all the rest of those copies, and you can wait here while I go free up disk space like crazy, and in half an hour I'll come back and you'll be good to go again. One last little thing. For the purposes of speed, you do lose a little bit of flexibility. If you're in a really important production environment where you plan your pushes and, then this isn't the right thing to do. If you're developing and there's no, your user base is you, or maybe you and a couple other people, then you can do a repository cache. What that does is it checks out your code into a subdirectory, and instead of doing a Subversion checkout every time from your trunk, it makes a copy of the existing Subversion, does an up, so it only changes what's changed since the last time you deployed, and then deploys to that. So that's substantially faster. A straight disk copy is heavily optimized by really smart people who do file systems, and, an SVN up is going to be a heck of a lot faster than checking out every single source code file. And if you're, following the prescribed all of Rails each time, if you have that frozen in your application, it gets to be a lot and you can cut back on your deployment time, I don't know, probably to about a third of what it is if you've got a reasonably chunky app and lots of, especially if you have a lot of graphics. If you're serving up some files that come with your app, if like we have a couple PDF documents that just kind of live in our files directory and get served up, those take time. So this removes that headache because you're not touching those very often. And that's it. Any questions? Awesome. Sure. Yes. Basically, you would specify roles for each of the environments you want to deploy to. Okay? So, for instance, staging is an incredibly common role that you'll see in a lot of recipes. A lot of people want to be able to deploy their app to a virtual production environment that isn't the real production environment. We're set up, or almost set up, we're working on setting up a box that will deploy to staging, which is a fresh copy of our production database from last night's backup. That box is carefully isolated so it can't send email to customers or do any of those evil things that testing and production often get you. Otherwise, though, it's supposed to be as perfect as we can get mirror of production so that we can go in there and say, okay, did we break anything this time? And that our integration tests hopefully will be all set up in water so that they'll run automatically and tell us, hey, the registration for your site, which is kind of the most important part, stop working. You probably should look into that before you deploy for the real deal. Like I said, that's just setting up roles. Different roles can have different settings. So for instance, say your testing environment has to be completely deployed into a home directory, because that's the only place you have permissions, right? You can go, home testing, you can log in as that user, and you can, maybe create directories in that subdirectory, but you can't go out to /u or to the root and do new things, right? Then basically what you're doing at that point is you're saying, okay, all those places, you can say when you're specifying sudo, there's a setting, a variable you would set that says, hey, instead of doing, trying to be root to do root-like tasks, do it as this user instead. And instead of deploying to /u, deploy to /home testing, my testing environment. You can kind of tailor your tasks for each individual environment, so that they're all still automated, that you can push to any of them the same as you normally would, but that you're that you're still living in those constraints, basically.
Does Capistrano require the ability to open chassis on a database server? Because this is sometimes inconvenient. Most of the DB administrators, for example, in larger companies would just allow the connection to a port for the SQL part of the task.
Absolutely. Truthfully, what that means is that you can you end up sort of lying to the Capistrano file and say, hey, the database role, which is really, the database role is the role in which you want your migrations to run, not the role where the database has to physically live. Okay? That should probably be renamed in the defaults. That would, but so for instance, we have two machines. One's called Ryza, one's called Vegas. Vegas is the app server. It's where the mongrels live, and the MySQL database that Vegas uses for its information is Ryza. When you deploy if you'd say in this instance that the database role is filled by Vegas, even though MySQL is not even installed on it. Okay? Because then what it's going to do is in the Rails app on Vegas, it's going to run the migrations. And because that Rails app already has permissions to talk to the database, right, over that open port, that those migrations are still going to happen. Okay? What's important is to have a primary database role, because you only want migrations to happen exactly once to your database. Right? We have a round-robin MySQL setup. If you go to 2 boxes and you do the migrations on both of them, you have created a very ugly situation that's going to take several hours to unwind. Okay? But in the instance you're talking about, what you would do is the box that the Rails app runs on would be where you would do your database migrations. And if you're not doing database migrations, if you're not calling cap deploy long, which is telling Capistrano, hey, go run the migrations, or cap deploy migrate, which is telling Capistrano, hey, run the migrations, you don't even have to specify that role. Okay? That's a completely optional role. It's not going to say, oh, I know you're deploying Rails, and I don't like that you didn't specify that. It's going to say, hey, there's nobody who fills this role.
That concludes this episode of the SD.RB podcast. See you next time.